When one reads about or listens to the topic of ship refits and rebuilds, the Italians will inevitably always come up towards the top of the list. They had something of a penchant for taking old ships and putting them through absolutely massive overhauls to try and bring them to a more modern standard. This could be something like Garibaldi, where they took an old light cruiser and, among other things, put ballistic missile tubes aboard her. The more famous cases, though, are the old dreadnoughts, the Cavours and the Dorias. With good reason. These are, in many ways, the most extensive rebuilds any old battleship went through while coming out as a battleship. They went in as outdated relics of a bygone age and came out as small, admittedly poorly armored, fast battleships. A tad on the slow side for a fast battleship of the Second World War, perhaps, but when one thinks of how they started, it's no mean feat. This video will, however, focus less on the specific details of the refits. It will cover the major changes, certainly, but it's more focused on if these refits were worth the effort and cost. The thing to very much keep in mind as I get into this, though, the refits of the Cavours and of the Dorias are very different beasts. The ships that came out were pretty similar in overall capabilities, differing mostly in their secondary batteries. This is true. But the context of the refits, well, that's a different story. The time frame alone makes them quite distinct from each other. The global situation, the financial situation of Italy, and the utility of the refits are very different between 1937 and 1933. So keep that in mind as we begin with the first refits, the Conte di Cavour. In context of their time, these refits make substantially more sense for Italy to have undertaken. In the early 1930s, the Italian economy remained fairly fragile. They had not built a new battleship since the Great War, having cancelled their super dreadnoughts before completion. Their old dreadnoughts bounced in and out of service as the Navy struggled to find funding and men to man them, even as they grew more and more outdated. Enter, then, the French and their new Dunkirk. This small battleship was laid down in 1932 as a direct counter to the German construction of their Panzerschiff. Dunkirk was not intended to be directed at Italy, though by all means she was capable of engaging any Italian battleship and beating it handily. So, Italy, in the midst of a rivalry with France, saw a need to counter the new ship. More pertinently, they saw a need to counter her quickly. Italian naval designers had, off and on, proposed small battleships or battle cruisers in around the same size range as Dunkirk during the late 1920s. These had gone nowhere over budgetary concerns and at least some intention to follow the treaty system. Similar attempts to modernize the old dreadnoughts, foundered on the seeming impossibility of improving their underwater protection, already recognized as fatally outdated. Now faced with a need to counter the new French battleship, the Italians scrambled a bit. The old concept designs and new attempts at a fresh counter were dismissed. While likely to be superior ships being freshly built from the keel up, the time needed to do so was viewed as excessive. Or rather, viewed as excessive compared to modernization of the old ships. The new designs in response to Dunkirk used the Cavour's hull form as a starting point, which convinced Italian Naval Command that with a suitably large rebuild, the old ships could be given adequate underwater protection. Discussions at this point largely pivoted towards refitting some, or all, of the remaining old dreadnoughts. Namely because, as one could expect, costs were a factor. It was viewed as cheaper and faster to rebuild the old dreadnoughts than to design and build new ships. As it would turn out, the cost of refitting the two Cavours would go over budget, and the predicted 2 years of rebuild time stretched out to 4 years instead. Still, with the politicians watching to see how the Navy treaties impacted future capital ship construction, it wasn't a bad decision, at least at the time. The rebuilds of these two ships, and only these two as the Dorias had to wait their turn, made sense. Italy needed a counter to Dunkirk, and they only had their old dreadnoughts to modernize. While I do believe a new built ship, probably based on the existing design concepts, would have been better, well, they did what they needed to do. The Cavours came out of their rebuilds as functionally new ships, retaining maybe half of their old structure, with the rest completely new. Ships that were small and under-armored even by Great War standards were modernized into, still small and lightly armored, fast battleships. That's an accomplishment that shouldn't be ignored. In the context of 1932, when the decision was made, it was a sound one, for the most part. Individually, Cavour and Cesare came out as still inferior to Dunkirk. Together, they were a theoretical match for the French battleship. Furthermore, the extensive rebuild, most especially their increase in speed, made them superior to the old French battleships still hanging around. They could sail with lighter forces and dictate the engagement in a way that the French couldn't. All of this sounds good, perhaps. However, even by 1937, the Italians performed studies that made it clear they were aware of the limitations of these rebuilds. They were leaky where the old bow structure joined the new one. They had issues with operating at speed in rough weather. Their armor protection was, while improved, still incredibly vulnerable to Dunkirk and British battleships, which were an expected threat by 1937. The deck protection was still very light, and the belt armor wasn't really improved at all. Their guns had issues with dispersion, and were, at best, only slightly less capable than Dunkirk's guns. That's at best. They were arguably worse than that, and certainly inferior to British 15-inch guns. Most damning, honestly, is that the underwater protection remained compromised. The application of the Puglisi system on these ships was a hack job. It wasn't built into the design like on Littorio, which meant it had to be built inside the hull instead of in blisters to maintain the speed increase. This was a system that relied on having a large cylinder to absorb the explosive force of a torpedo and crumple down as a result. On the Cavours, it was entirely too slim to work properly, especially at the narrower ends of the hull. So, as early as 1937, the Cavours are apparent as a decently capable pair of ships, but ones with flaws that remain inherent to their designs. They were small and under-armored, and generally underperforming ships when built. No amount of rebuilding could change that fact. The decision to rebuild them still made sense and produced capable warships nonetheless, just not as capable as Italy would have liked. With that done, we move to the Dorias. Keep in mind here that the study I mentioned was in 1937. When were the Dorias rebuilt? They started in 1937. Well, to be fair, the decision to modernize them dates back to 1935. Indications were that the Cavours would be effective uses of the money, while the Littorios were still some ways away. Cost overruns or not, it still seemed cheaper to rebuild the old battleships if Italy needed more forces quickly. There was also a certain prevailing belief in Italian command circles that can be summed up as such. Well, most everyone else is refitting old relics, so why shouldn't we do the same? Okay, I'm being a bit sarcastic here. Nonetheless, that was a major factor in the decision to rebuild the Dorias. A persistent belief that other navies were mostly sailing around with ships of similar vintage, so rebuilding the old ships would produce ships roughly on par with these other navies. Perhaps this was true of France, who put almost no effort into modernizing their old battleships. But it was not the case with Britain, who was already beginning to be seen as a potential foe. In any event, while the decision is questionable, the Italians saw it as somewhat necessary. The unmodernized Dorias were worthless in actual combat. They couldn't keep up with modern forces, their guns and armor were outdated, and their combat utility was pretty much zero. Keeping them around in their Great War design was not really worthwhile. Thus the decision to take lessons from the Cavours and the construction of the first two Littorios. The main features of the refits are the same. These include the removal of the amidships triple turret and the boring out of the guns to 320mm, 12.6 inches, on the remaining 10 main battery guns. The power plant, similarly, was increased in power with new turbines and boilers, while reducing the number of shafts from 4 down to 2. Past this, though, the Dorias, in comparison to the Cavours, had much more extensive rebuilds. This can be summed up as such. Cavour had a new bow grafted on top of her old one. This was, as mentioned, incredibly leaky and not ideal. Andrea Doria, then, would have had an entirely new bow structure. This was still leaky where it joined the old hull, but not anywhere near as bad. Secondly, Cavour had been refit with 12 120mm guns and 6 twin mountings, alongside 8 100mm anti-aircraft guns and 4 twin mounts. Doria would directly improve upon this with a dozen 135mm guns and 4 triple turrets for her secondary battery, alongside lifting the 90mm anti-aircraft guns of Littorio to replace the old 100mm mounts, fitting 10 of the 90mm guns in single mountings. Those are the major differences between the two sets of rebuilds. It probably doesn't seem like much. It very much is. The rebuilds of the Dorias, which are ostensibly done on the cheap in comparison to a new battleship, came out to almost twice as expensive as those of the Cavours. Furthermore, the cost of rebuilding the Doria sisters came out, cumulatively, as fairly close to the cost of a single Littorio. Not quite there, mind you, but closer than the Italian Admiralty might have been comfortable with. More importantly, the cost in resources is not to be understated. While the decision to rebuild the old battleships came a year before the laying down of the second pair of Littorios, there is almost certainly an impact on the construction of Roma and Impero. Italian industry, buckling somewhat under sanctions, had issues with producing enough steel plates, among other things. While it's difficult to say for sure, one can make an argument that not rebuilding the Dorias might have allowed for a faster completion of Roma and finishing Impero, period. Certainly, had the two Dorias just been scrapped outright, the Italians would have had a surplus of steel their industry desperately needed, in exchange for two ships that, while more capable than Cavour, were already second line by the time they finished rebuilding, being as they finished in 1940, when Italy was already at war with Britain. About the best thing I think you can say about the Doria rebuilds is that they gave Italy 2 battleships for training duty and flagship roles after the Littorios were scrapped by treaty in the aftermath of World War II. Now, with all of that done, we come back to the core question of the video. Were these refits worth it for Italy? Well, yes and no. Very much a hard no for Andrea Doria and her sister. By 1937, it should have been abundantly apparent that Italy was going to be ditching the treaty system. Equally, it should have been clear that modernizing these ships would produce vessels of questionable practical utility, even in comparison to other old battleships. Italy would have gotten more value out of just scrapping them, be it to build new medium battleships, which wasn't very likely but was still a potential option in 1937, or just using that scrap and money to accelerate construction of the second pair of Littorios, which were already pretty likely to be built even in 1937. Was it entirely possible that Italy still would have struggled to finish Roma and Impero anyway? Maybe. Yet one cannot deny that resources went into the Dorias, which didn't even finish until World War II had kicked off, that could have been used elsewhere. Don't get me wrong, I love the ships. They're absolutely beautiful in their rebuilt state. But beauty does not equate to combat effectiveness. As for the Cavours, though, in the context of 1932, when Italy needed capable battleships quickly, and it was faster and cheaper to get decently usable modernized battleships, yes, rebuilding the Cavours made some sense. For the mid-1930s, they were perfectly good ships and a good use of money. Remember, they were intended to be finished in 1935. And even in World War II, they were at least a menace to cruisers and old French battleships. However, I can't escape the thought that building one of the medium battleship or battlecruiser design concepts would have been a better use of the money, ton for ton. Dunkirk and Strasbourg would prove to not see much actual use, and a medium battleship was of questionable real utility against treaty battleships, let alone post-treaty designs. That being said, in comparison to the still less than capable rebuilt Cavour, a new ship would probably have been more capable, built from the ground up with better design practices, better armor, better guns, all of those things. So in the case of the Cavours, the answer really is a mixed bag. They made sense, they were worth the effort, but a new ship was probably still the better long-term option. Nonetheless, the Italian rebuilds, both pairs of them, remain a triumph of engineering and technology that are worthy of respect. If not for their combat capabilities, then certainly for their beauty and the ingenuity that went into them. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.